Co-parenting in the Western world largely runs without animosity because the parties involved understand what it takes to share custody. They understand boundaries, responsibility, emotional maturity, and the long-term implications of their actions. But in Africa, co-parenting is often like a war. It feels like fighting an endless battle with an ex-partner, and this reality largely depends on how the partners involved separated. The fight that led to their separation does not end when the relationship ends. Instead, it quietly transforms into the foundation of the next phase of life. Unfortunately, the innocent children become the ones forced to stand on that foundation. Let me use Nigeria as a case study. Nigeria is a nation with an enormous population and a wide range of cultural identities, beliefs, and traditions. It is a country where family has always been central to social structure, identity, and survival. For generations, family life followed a predictable pattern shaped by culture, elders, and shared expectations. During the time of our forefathers, co-parenting as we know it today did not really exist. This was not because marriages were free of conflict or because love was perfect, but because culture was the bedrock of marriage. Marriage was seen as sacred, permanent, and communal. It was not simply the union of two people, it was the union of families, clans, and bloodlines. In those days, separation was rare. When problems arose, families intervened. Elders mediated. Disagreements were addressed within the collective, not exposed publicly. Even when a couple struggled deeply, the idea of raising children in two separate homes was almost unthinkable. Children belonged to the family structure as a whole, and that structure provided stability, discipline, and continuity. There were no custody battles. No visitation schedules. No emotional negotiations over who loved the child more. The child grew under one authority, guided by shared values. But time moved forward. Education expanded. Urbanization increased. Economic pressures intensified. Civilization arrived with modern ideals of individual happiness, personal freedom, and emotional fulfillment. Love gradually shifted from being culturally guided to being emotionally driven. People began to marry for love, not obligation. This change brought beauty and choice, but it also brought fragility. When love became the primary foundation of marriage, separation became more common because once love faded, conflict intensified. This was the moment co-parenting entered African societies. Civilization introduced the idea that two people could separate and still raise a child together. In theory, this was progressive. It suggested maturity, shared responsibility, and emotional balance. But in practice, Africa adopted the concept of co-parenting without fully adopting its core values. The system arrived faster than the emotional education needed to sustain it. In Nigeria today, co-parenting rarely begins on neutral ground. It usually begins from pain. From betrayal. From anger. From disappointment. From unresolved trauma. The reason behind the separation becomes the lens through which parenting is carried out. Co-parenting is no longer centered on the child's emotional safety but on the narrative of the breakup. Was it infidelity that ended the relationship? Was it domestic conflict? Was it financial instability? Was it emotional neglect? Was it lack of intimacy? Was it family interference or unmet expectations? These unanswered questions do not fade away after separation. They linger. They harden. They become silent weapons. And the child becomes the space where these unresolved emotions play out. In many Nigerian co-parenting situations, parents are not cooperating, they are competing. Each parent is trying to prove a point, to themselves, to society, or to their former partner. Some want to be seen as the better parent. Some want sympathy. Some want control. And some simply want revenge. The language of co-parenting becomes hostile. Communication is tense or non-existent. Every request feels like a demand. Every compromise feels like defeat. This emotional warfare deeply affects the child. A child does not understand betrayal. A child does not understand infidelity. A child does not understand financial stress or emotional incompatibility. What the child understands is tone, energy, behavior, silence, hostility. And children absorb these things quietly. In many Nigerian homes, a mother may consciously or unconsciously speak negatively about the father in front of the child. Sometimes it is subtle. Sometimes it is direct. Sometimes it is disguised as honesty. Words like, "Your father does not care, he abandoned us," or, "He chose another woman over you," become part of the child's emotional vocabulary. These words may be rooted in pain, but they shape the child's perception permanently. In other cases, fathers do the same. They paint the mother as wicked, selfish, manipulative, or irresponsible. They speak of her with bitterness. They frame the child as a victim of her decisions. And the child, caught between two narratives, feels confused, guilty, and emotionally torn. There are also situations where access becomes a weapon. One parent, often the mother, because the child usually resides with her, decides to restrict the other parent's involvement. Calls go unanswered. Visits are postponed indefinitely. Excuses pile up. Over time, the child grows distant from one parent, not because that parent does not care, but because access has been denied. This is where co-parenting becomes deeply destructive. The child begins to internalize absence as rejection. They grow up believing they were unwanted. They struggle with self-worth, self-confidence. They hid themselves in empty shells. This form emotional gaps that follow them into adulthood. And because these wounds are formed early, they are difficult to heal. The root of this problem lies in the fact that African Gen Z largely accepted co-parenting as a concept but did not accept the discipline and responsibility behind it. Co-parenting is not simply moving on. It is not about independence alone. It requires emotional maturity, restraint, communication, and child-centered thinking. Unfortunately, many parents model their co-parenting behaviors after what they see online: short videos, motivational quotes, and social media narratives that glorify cutting people off without considering long-term consequences. Social media encourages self-preservation but rarely teaches emotional accountability. It celebrates strength but ignores healing. It promotes boundaries but often forgets balance. Many parents adopt a mindset of, "I owe my ex nothing," forgetting that they still owe their child stability, honesty, and emotional safety. The children raised in these environments grow up watching conflict disguised as normalcy. They learn that love is conditional. They learn that relationships are temporary. They learn that anger is a valid form of communication. And because children learn more from observation than instruction, they repeat these patterns later in life. In Nigeria, many adults who struggle with commitment, trust, and emotional regulation are products of unhealthy co-parenting environments. They grew up seeing bitterness instead of cooperation, silence instead of communication, blame instead of accountability. When they attempt relationships of their own, they carry unresolved wounds into them. Many marriages fail not because love is absent, but because emotional tools were never learned. The Nigerian girl child is particularly affected by this dynamic. Often raised primarily by her mother, she is exposed repeatedly to one version of events. Over time, that narrative becomes her worldview. She may grow up with deep-seated mistrust toward men, shaped not by her own experiences but by inherited pain. Without balance, guidance, or healing, she enters adulthood guarded, defensive, and emotionally cautious. Now, when we compare this to the Western world, the contrast becomes clearer. In many Western societies, co-parenting is not perfect, but it is structured. It is supported by legal frameworks, counseling systems, and social norms that emphasize the child's well-being. Parents are educated, sometimes forced, to understand that their personal conflict must not harm the child. Custody arrangements are clearly defined. Visitation rights are enforced. Parental alienation is recognized as harmful behavior. Western parents are often taught that speaking negatively about the other parent in front of the child causes emotional damage. Therapy and mediation are commonly encouraged. Schools, courts, and social institutions play a role in protecting the child's emotional stability. Even when a child grows up in two separate homes, they often experience consistency. They know when they will see each parent. They know they are loved. They are not used as emotional messengers or bargaining tools. Although they may miss the experience of having both parents under one roof, they are often spared the constant emotional tension that characterizes many African co-parenting situations. Co-parenting has come to stay in the Western world, and systems have evolved to support it. In Africa, however, the system arrived without the necessary emotional education, legal clarity, and cultural adaptation. As a result, co-parenting has become a source of emotional instability for many children rather than a solution. But this does not mean Africa is incapable of healthy co-parenting. It simply means Africa needs understanding, intentional learning, and cultural recalibration. For co-parenting to truly improve lives in Africa, couples, especially newly married ones, must understand its core values before problems arise. They must accept that love can fail, but parenting must not. They must learn to separate romantic disappointment from parental responsibility. They must understand that children are not emotional shock absorbers. African societies must begin to normalize emotional education. Parents must be taught how to resolve conflict without involving their children. Extended families and community leaders must redefine their role, not as enablers of bitterness, but as protectors of children's emotional health. If Africa can blend its traditional emphasis on community, responsibility, and collective care with the structured co-parenting system seen in the Western world, the outcome can be transformative. Children will grow up with clarity instead of confusion. With balance instead of bias. With love instead of loyalty conflicts. At its core, co-parenting is not a punishment. It is not a failure. It is a responsibility, and when handled poorly, it produces emotionally wounded individuals who will struggle with trust and stability in nearby future. When handled with maturity, it produces resilient children who understand that even when relationships end, love and responsibility remain. The future of African society depends largely on how today's parents handle separation. Because children are always watching. They are listening. They are learning. And what they learn today will shape the homes they build tomorrow. Please, follow this page and share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. Thank you for watching.